My boss used to give his leg to help homeless people until one stabbed him with an infected needle and left him $200,000 in debt. So he started poisoning our restaurant's leftovers to drive them away. But his 7-year-old daughter Lucy ate one of the poisoned meals, and when we found her vomiting behind the counter, he said she chose their side and made her choice. So we documented everything while he tried to destroy evidence until corporate fired him, but he kept breaking in at 3 a.m. and slashing our tires and threatening staff who testified against him. My boss Greg was the type of guy to give his leg to a homeless person so they could eat, until he gave the wrong person our leftovers and got stabbed with an infected needle as a thank you. He spent 28 days in the hospital and walked out $200,000 in debt, and from that day on, he swore he'd die before helping another one of those scum. I just nodded because I never expected anything to come out of that. But then leading up to Christmas, corporate announced a $2,000 bonus for the best performing restaurant. Our area was filled with homeless people, and so Greg immediately started implementing customer experience improvements to discourage the homeless from loitering. He moved outdoor seating closer to windows for better visibility, installed brighter lighting, and played classical music outside. When families stopped avoiding our location and sales jumped 15%, corporate awarded Greg the bonus and praised his proactive management approach. Greg felt validated, finally giving his Lucy the best Christmas in years. He began arriving early, ensuring staff understood the importance of maintaining a welcoming environment for families. Greg started documenting every incident when homeless individuals asked customers for change, slept near the building, or used bathrooms without purchasing. His district manager called it excellent loss prevention work. Greg researched other successful locations, studying their crowd control methods. He told us, "We're not being mean, we're being professional. Paying customers deserve a clean, safe experience." Staff who seemed uncomfortable were reminded about our improved performance metrics. Greg's ambitions grew when a corporate position opened up. He told us this promotion would secure his family's future and started implementing what he called advanced security measures. He installed security cameras aimed at nearby alleys where homeless people gathered, claiming it was for employee safety. He'd spend hours reviewing footage, taking notes on individual patterns and behaviors. When I suggested it seemed excessive, Greg snapped, "You don't understand the bigger picture. I'm protecting our investment." He started calling police for increasingly minor infractions like someone sitting near our building, using our Wi-Fi, even walking past slowly. When officers stopped responding, Greg accused them of enabling criminal behavior. Things escalated when Greg purchased pepper spray and a taser, keeping them behind the counter. He began confronting homeless people directly, following them down the street, yelling that they were banned permanently. One evening, I watched him corner an elderly homeless woman in our parking lot with pepper spray, screaming inches from her face about respecting private property while she cowered against a dumpster. When our assistant manager suggested he was going too far, Greg exploded, "You want corporate to shut us down? You want to lose your job?" He reassigned anyone who questioned his methods to terrible shifts. Greg's own daughter stopped visiting after school, and when staff asked about her, he got defensive and changed the subject. For 3 weeks, the back booth where she used to do homework sat empty. But then one day she returned full of smiles, telling us all about how she changed Daddy's mind. Apparently Greg agreed to hand out our leftovers for one day only. As Greg warmly handed out meals, greeting each person cheerfully, we started to believe he had rediscovered his humanity. But within 15 minutes, that hope shattered. People suddenly doubled over, violently vomiting onto the pavement. One man collapsed, gasping for air, clutching his stomach in agony. The parking lot became a nightmare, filled with cries of pain. The staff froze in shock as the scene unfolded before us, disbelief etched into every face. Greg stood calmly, eyes cold, and said, "They won't come back now." Police refused to do their job, so I had to take matters into my own hands. "Don't you see? It's for our own good." "You poisoned them?" someone shouted, horrified. "No," Greg snapped defensively. "I just made sure they'd understand they're not welcome. It's harmless. I'm just protecting us." "You've lost it," I yelled, rushing toward the victims. I frantically dialed 911 as other staff hurried to help, bringing water, towels, and comfort. My heart pounded, rage and disbelief swirling inside me. That's when I realized Lucy wasn't by the door anymore. I scanned the chaos, my stomach dropping. "Where's Lucy?" I called out. A sickening silence fell. Panic filled Greg's eyes for the first time. She wouldn't have," he stammered. Minutes later, we found her behind the counter, curled in a fetal position, clutching an empty wrapper from one of the tainted meals. Her small body trembled violently, her breathing shallow. "Daddy," she whimpered weakly, reaching for Greg. Greg stumbled backward, his face twisted with disgust and denial. "You chose their side," he hissed, eyes burning with betrayal. "I warned you to stay away from them." "She's your daughter, Greg," I screamed, cradling the child gently as sirens wailed in the distance. He stood rigid, disconnected, eyes empty of remorse. She knew what she was doing. She made her choice. As paramedics flooded the restaurant, I held Greg's daughter tightly, whispering promises that help was coming. The paramedics worked frantically, loading victims onto stretchers while more ambulances arrived. I watched Greg's face remain stone cold as they carried his daughter away, her small hand reaching weakly toward him one last time before the ambulance doors closed. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Staff members rushed between helping victims and confronting Greg, who stood motionless by the counter, arms crossed defensively. Margaret, our senior server who'd worked here for 15 years, pushed past everyone and slapped Greg across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the dining room. Greg barely flinched. He straightened his tie and surveyed the scene with calculating eyes. The district manager would hear about this soon. Corporate would investigate. His promotion hung in the balance, and I could see him already formulating his defense strategy. Within minutes, he sprang into action. Greg grabbed the security camera DVR from the back office, yanking cables loose. He shoved the device into a garbage bag and headed for the dumpster. I intercepted him in the kitchen, blocking his path. He tried to shoulder past me, but I held firm. Other staff members gathered behind me, forming a human wall. Greg's eyes darted between us, measuring his options. The garbage bag swung heavily at his side. Christopher, our cook, stepped forward and snatched the bag from Greg's grip. Inside, we found not just the DVR, but also bottles of ipecac syrup, the substance Greg had mixed into the food. The evidence of his premeditated attack sat heavy in Christopher's hands. Greg lunged for the bag, but we held him back. His composed facade cracked, revealing the desperate man underneath. He started making promises, offering raises, better shifts, vacation time. When that failed, he switched to threats about unemployment, blacklisting, ruined careers. The ambulances had cleared most of the victims, but police hadn't arrived yet. Greg seized this window, pulling out his phone to call the district manager first. We listened as he spun an elaborate tale about a contamination accident, about following proper procedures, about staff negligence. His voice remained steady, professional, convincing. Margaret grabbed the phone from his hand and hung up. Greg's face flushed purple with rage. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling into a prep table. That triggered an explosion of movement as staff rushed to help Margaret while others restrained Greg. He broke free and bolted for the back exit. I chased him through the kitchen, dodging around equipment and slipping on the greasy floor. Greg burst through the door into the alley where he'd spent so many hours harassing the homeless. The irony wasn't lost on me. I caught up as he fumbled with his car keys. We grappled briefly before I managed to knock the keys from his hand. They skittered under a dumpster. Greg dropped to his knees, desperately reaching for them, his expensive suit scraping against the filthy pavement. Christopher appeared with several other staff members, surrounding Greg in the alley. He looked up at us, calculating his next move. Then he tried a different approach. couch, tears suddenly streaming down his face. He sobbed about Lucy, about medical bills, about just trying to protect his family. Some staff members wavered, their anger mixing with pity. Greg sensed the shift and pressed harder, reminding us of better times, of holiday bonuses, of how he'd covered shifts when we needed time off. He painted himself as a victim of circumstances, driven to desperate measures. I reminded everyone about Lucy, poisoned by her own father's hatred. The wavering stopped. Greg's tears dried instantly, replaced by cold fury. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees, and made one final attempt at authority. He ordered us back to work, threatened to fire everyone on the spot. When we didn't move, he pulled out his phone again, this time calling corporate security. He reported a staff mutiny, requesting immediate assistance. His performance was flawless, hitting every corporate buzzword about liability and brand protection. Margaret had recovered and joined us in the alley. She held up her own phone, revealing she'd been recording everything since Greg's first threatening response. Greg's face went pale as he realized his own words would damn him. The police finally arrived, followed closely by two corporate representatives who'd been dispatched after Greg's calls. The scene they found defied Greg's narrative completely. Victim statements, physical evidence, and Margaret's recording painted a clear picture. Greg's transformation from generous to vengeful seems awfully complete after one bad experience. I'm curious how someone goes from giving away their leg metaphorically to poisoning people, including their own daughter who just wanted to help others. Greg tried one last manipulation, pulling the officers aside for a private conversation. I watched him gesture animatedly, pointing at various staff members, clearly trying to shift blame. The officers listened politely but kept glancing at the evidence bags containing the ipecac bottles. The corporate representatives interviewed each staff member separately. Greg hovered nearby, trying to interrupt, to correct, to influence. They eventually asked him to wait in the dining room while they completed their investigation. I found him sitting in Lucy's usual booth, staring at her abandoned backpack. For a moment, his mask slipped completely. I saw genuine anguish flash across his face before he noticed me watching. The mask snapped back into place, harder than before. He started explaining again, justifying his actions with twisted logic about protecting the restaurant, about corporate expectations, about survival of the fittest. His words came faster, more desperate, as if he could convince reality to bend to his narrative through sheer repetition. The district manager arrived within the hour. Greg practically ran to him, launching into his version of events before the man even entered the building. The district manager listened stone-faced, then walked past Greg to speak with the corporate representatives. I watched Greg's confidence crumble as his supposed ally ignored him. He trailed behind the district manager like a lost puppy, still talking, still explaining, still trying to control the narrative. The man who'd terrorized our workplace for months suddenly looked pathetic. The corporate representative spent the next hour documenting everything, while Greg paced the dining room like a caged animal. I watched him approach different staff members, attempting to pull them aside for private conversations. Each time they turned away or busied themselves with cleanup tasks. His isolation grew more pronounced with every rejection. Margaret organized the staff into teams, some helping paramedics with final victim information, others preserving evidence despite Greg's earlier attempts at destruction. I focused on securing the kitchen area where Greg had prepared the tainted food. Christopher found more ipecac bottles hidden behind cleaning supplies, along with Greg's handwritten notes calculating dosages. The district manager finally emerged from his meeting with corporate representatives. Greg rushed toward him, but the man held up his hand, stopping Greg mid-stride. The district manager's expression remained unreadable as he surveyed the chaos. Greg's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his rehearsed explanations dying on his lips. Two more police officers arrived, these ones wearing detective badges. They immediately began photographing the scene and collecting witness statements. Greg watched from his booth, his fingers drumming nervously on the table where Lucy used to spread out her homework. Every few minutes, he'd stand as if to intervene, then sit back down when officers glanced his way. I helped Margaret gather employee records and schedules, evidence of Greg's retaliatory shift changes. We found documentation showing how he'd systematically punished anyone who questioned his methods. The paper trail revealed a pattern of escalating harassment that corporate couldn't ignore. Greg must have sensed the walls closing in. He suddenly stood and walked toward the back office, moving with forced casualness. Christopher and I followed, keeping distance but staying alert. Greg entered the office and began stuffing papers into his briefcase, his movements growing frantic when he realized we were watching. The detective appeared in the doorway, politely but firmly asking Greg to step away from the desk. Greg's hands trembled as he set down the briefcase. Inside, we could see employee termination forms he'd been preparing, all dated for today, targeting staff members who'd opposed him. Back in the dining room, the district manager was on his phone, his voice low but urgent. I caught fragments about emergency protocols and crisis management. Greg hovered nearby, straining to hear, his face cycling through expressions of hope and dread with each overheard word. Margaret pulled me aside, showing me her phone. She'd been documenting Greg's behavior for weeks, videos of him harassing homeless individuals, recordings of his threatening speeches to staff. The evidence was overwhelming. Greg had built his own downfall, one cruel act at a time. The afternoon wore on with Greg growing increasingly agitated. He made multiple attempts to leave, each time stopped by either police or corporate representatives who insisted he remain available. His confident manager persona had completely dissolved, replaced by a cornered animal's desperation. I overheard him calling his wife, his voice breaking as he tried to explain why he wouldn't be home for dinner. He couldn't bring himself to mention Lucy's condition, instead focusing on corporate politics and unfair treatment. Even now, he was crafting a narrative where he was the victim. The detective began formal interviews in the back office. Greg waited his turn in the dining room, surrounded by empty tables and the lingering smell of disinfectant from the cleanup. He sat in different booths, unable to stay still, avoiding Lucy's usual spot like it might burn him. Christopher discovered more evidence in the freezer, a separate batch of meals Greg had prepared and labeled. The implications were chilling. This hadn't been a momentary lapse, but a calculated plan. Greg had prepared multiple batches, suggesting he'd intended to continue poisoning people. Word began spreading among the staff about what they'd found. The mood shifted from shock to anger. Greg must have felt it because he retreated to a corner booth, pulling out his phone to scroll through what looked like job listings. His fingers moved mechanically, but his eyes kept darting toward the door. The district manager finished his calls and approached Greg's booth. Their conversation was quiet but tense. Greg's face flushed red, then went pale. He stood abruptly, knocking over his water glass. The district manager remained seated, calmly watching as Greg fumbled with napkins to clean the spill. Margaret coordinated with other staff members to compile a comprehensive timeline of Greg's descent. They documented every incident, every threat, every retaliatory action. The picture that emerged showed a man who'd weaponized his authority, turning the workplace into his personal kingdom of cruelty. Greg made another attempt to access the office computer system, claiming he needed to submit routine reports. The detective stationed there turned him away. Greg's hands clenched and unclenched as he walked back to the dining room, muttering about corporate procedures and proper protocols. I noticed him eyeing the emergency exits, calculating distances and obstacles. Christopher must have noticed too because he positioned himself strategically, ready to intercept if Greg bolted. The tension in the room felt like a held breath, everyone waiting for Greg's next move. The corporate representatives finally called Greg for his interview. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the office with forced confidence. Through the window, I could see him gesturing emphatically, his mouth moving rapidly. The representatives took notes, their faces carefully neutral. While Greg was occupied, the staff gathered in the kitchen, stories poured out about his behavior over recent months. The assistant manager revealed how Greg had threatened her children's college funds. A newer employee described being forced to work while sick because Greg wouldn't approve time off after she'd questioned his methods. The pattern was clear. Greg had created a culture of fear, using corporate policies as weapons and his position as a shield. But his biggest mistake was underestimating our willingness to protect each other when pushed too far. Greg emerged from his interview looking smaller somehow. His shirt was untucked, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. He tried to project authority, announcing that everyone should return to normal duties, but his voice cracked. No one moved. The detective asked Greg to accompany him to the station for further questioning. Greg's face went through a series of transformations: denial, anger, bargaining, all in seconds. He demanded to call a lawyer, then changed his mind, insisting he'd cooperate fully to clear up this misunderstanding. As they prepared to leave, Greg turned back toward the staff, his mouth opened as if to deliver one final speech, one last attempt at control. But seeing our faces, united in condemnation, he deflated. His shoulders sagged as he followed the detective out. The restaurant felt different without Greg's oppressive presence. Staff members began sharing stories more freely, laughing nervously at first, then with genuine relief. The district manager announced he'd be personally overseeing operations while corporate decided on a permanent solution. But our relief was premature. Within an hour, Greg returned, released pending further investigation. He stood in the doorway, technically still our manager, his eyes scanning the room like a predator seeking weakness. The detective had warned him against interfering with witnesses, but Greg had always been creative with rules. He began issuing orders with mechanical precision, assigning cleaning tasks and inventory counts. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wild. Staff members looked between him and the district manager, unsure who to obey. The power struggle was just beginning. Greg retreated to the office, claiming he needed to file insurance reports about the contamination incident. Through the window, I watched him making phone calls, his gestures growing more animated with each conversation. He was building something, planning something. Why does Greg keep trying the same tactics that clearly aren't working anymore? His constant attempts to manipulate the officers and corporate reps seem almost desperate, like he genuinely believes his old tricks still have power here. The district manager tried to intervene, suggesting Greg take administrative leave. Greg produced corporate handbook pages, citing policies about due process and suspension procedures. He'd transformed from desperate man to legal tactician, using bureaucracy as his new weapon. Margaret gathered several senior staff members, forming an impromptu leadership council. They began documenting current operations, creating a paper trail that would function with or without Greg. It was a quiet revolution, undermining his authority through superior organization. Greg must have sensed the shift because he emerged from the office with a new strategy. He began praising certain staff members, offering compliments and promises of advancement. He was trying to divide us, to recreate the fear-based loyalty he'd once commanded. Some newer employees wavered, uncertain about their futures. Greg seized on their hesitation, pulling them aside for one-on-one conversations about career development and loyalty. His manipulation was subtle but effective, planting seeds of doubt about who they should trust. The afternoon stretched into evening with the restaurant in limbo. Customers were turned away, citing equipment maintenance. Greg insisted we could reopen, but the district manager overruled him. Their argument grew heated, corporate policies flying like weapons. I found myself checking on Lucy's backpack, still sitting in her usual booth. Inside were homework assignments, a half-eaten granola bar, and a hand-drawn card that read, "World's Best Dad." The irony was suffocating. Greg passed by, saw me looking, and his mask slipped again. For a moment, raw pain flashed across his face. Then he noticed my observation, and the walls slammed back up. He snatched the backpack, clutching it like evidence of his humanity, but his hands shook as he carried it to the office. The district manager made more calls, his frustration evident. Corporate procedures moved slowly, and Greg knew it. He was buying time, maneuvering through loopholes and technicalities. Every hour he remained was another chance to regain control. Christopher organized inventory teams, keeping everyone busy and away from Greg's influence. But Greg countered by questioning every count, demanding recounts, creating busy work that kept staff fragmented and frustrated. His tactical mind was still sharp despite everything. As night fell, the restaurant took on an eerie quality. Emergency lights cast strange shadows, and the empty dining room felt like a battlefield after the fight. Greg remained in the office, visible through the window like a general surveying his domain. The district manager finally announced that corporate had made a preliminary decision. Greg would be placed on administrative leave pending full investigation. Greg emerged from the office, corporate handbook in hand, already arguing about proper notification procedures and union regulations he'd never cared about before. The argument escalated, with Greg citing precedents and policies with surprising accuracy. He'd spent his office time researching, building a defensive position from corporate regulations. The district manager grew flustered, unprepared for this level of resistance. Margaret stepped forward with her phone, offering to play her recordings for corporate leadership. Greg's confidence cracked. He tried to argue about consent laws and privacy violations, but his voice had lost its conviction. The evidence was too overwhelming. Greg made one last, desperate play. He announced he was feeling ill, possibly from contamination exposure, and needed immediate medical attention. It was transparent manipulation, but it created a procedural problem. The district manager couldn't forcibly detain someone claiming medical distress. As Greg prepared to leave, ostensibly for the hospital, he grabbed several items from the office. Files, keys, and other materials disappeared into his briefcase. Christopher moved to stop him, but the district manager held him back, unwilling to risk assault allegations. Greg paused at the door, turning back one final time. His eyes swept across the staff, lingering on each face as if memorizing enemies. Then he smiled, a cold expression that promised this wasn't over. He knew corporate procedures better than anyone. He'd used that knowledge. The moment Greg left, the atmosphere shifted. Staff members began speaking freely about their experiences, their voices growing stronger with each shared story. The district manager listened, his expression growing more troubled as the full scope of Greg's behavior became clear. We spent the next hours securing the restaurant, changing passwords and protocols Greg might exploit. Margaret coordinated with corporate security, establishing new procedures. But we all knew Greg would return. He'd invested too much in his kingdom to abandon it. The district manager assigned temporary management, but the damage was evident. Staff members were traumatized, trust was shattered, and the restaurant's reputation hung by a thread. Greg's poison had spread far beyond the ipecac-laced meals. As we prepared to leave for the night, I noticed movement in the parking lot. Greg's car was parked across the street, engine running, his silhouette visible behind the wheel. He was watching, waiting, planning his next move. The war for the restaurant had only just begun. Greg had lost the first battle, but he'd spent years building his position. He knew every corporate policy, every procedural weakness. And somewhere in a hospital bed, his daughter lay poisoned by his hatred, the one victim he couldn't rationalize away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Greg would return with lawyers or corporate allies or some other weapon from his arsenal of manipulation. But tonight, we'd stood together. We'd refused to be divided by his tactics. That unity would be our strength in the battles ahead. The district manager locked the doors, but we all knew locks wouldn't keep Greg out. His keys might be confiscated, but his knowledge of the building, the systems, and our vulnerabilities remained. He'd spent months studying us like specimens. Now we were his enemies. As I drove home, I saw Greg's car following at a distance, not quite stalking, but making his presence known. At a red light, our eyes met in my rearview mirror. His expression was calm, calculating. This wasn't over. For Greg, Greg, it had just become personal. The next morning arrived too quickly. I found the restaurant already buzzing with activity, corporate security installing new cameras and changing locks. The district manager looked haggard, having spent the night fielding calls from corporate leadership. Greg's name was mentioned in hushed tones. Then we learned the news. Greg had been hospitalized overnight, claiming severe stress-related symptoms. His lawyer, appearing as if summoned from thin air, was already filing complaints about hostile work environment and constructive dismissal. Greg was fighting back with every weapon available. The staff gathered in the kitchen, voices mixing anger with fear. Some wanted to quit immediately. Others spoke of loyalty to each other, not letting Greg win. Margaret emerged as our unofficial leader, her years of experience and documented evidence making her invaluable. The district manager announced that corporate was sending a crisis team. Until they arrived, he'd oversee operations personally, but his authority felt temporary, uncertain. Greg had exploited that uncertainty before. We all wondered if he'd do it again. Christopher discovered something troubling while reviewing security footage. Greg had visited the restaurant at 3 a.m., using keys that should have been confiscated. He'd spent an hour in the building doing unknown activities. The new cameras hadn't been installed yet. We had no idea what he'd done. Paranoia spread through the staff. People checked their personal belongings, worried about tampering. The coffee makers were emptied and cleaned. Every surface was sanitized again. Greg had poisoned our trust as surely as he'd poisoned those meals. The temporary manager arrived, a corporate troubleshooter with a reputation for handling difficult transitions. She immediately implemented new protocols, but her unfamiliarity with our specific situation showed. Greg would exploit that weakness. We'd seen him do it before. By noon, protesters had gathered outside. Word of the poisoning had spread through the homeless community. They held signs condemning the restaurant, unaware that we were victims too. Greg's actions had created a public relations nightmare that threatened all our jobs. Inside, we tried to maintain normalcy, but every customer was viewed with suspicion. Were they genuine or sent by Greg to cause problems? The atmosphere was toxic, poisoned by months of Greg's manipulation and one terrible act of cruelty. The crisis team arrived in the afternoon. 3 corporate executives in identical suits. They interviewed each staff member again, their questions probing deeper than before. They were building a case, but whether for or against Greg remained unclear. Margaret shared her complete documentation with them, hours of recordings and videos. Their expressions grew increasingly grim as they reviewed the evidence. One executive excused herself to make urgent phone calls. The others continued their investigation with renewed intensity. Then came the twist none of us expected. Greg's wife arrived, Lucy's condition having stabilized enough for her to leave the hospital. She didn't come in anger but in sorrow, seeking answers about how her husband had become this person. She revealed things about Greg we'd never known. The mounting debts beyond the medical bills, the pressure from her family to provide better, the nights he'd spent awake, planning ways to save the restaurant and secure their future. It didn't excuse his actions, but it explained his desperation. The conversation was interrupted by commotion outside. Greg's wife showing up right when the corporate team is building their case feels awfully convenient for his sympathy campaign. She's painting him as a desperate father while he was literally stalking employees last night and breaking into the building at 3 a.m. What exactly was he doing in there for an hour? Greg had arrived, discharged from the hospital and flanked by 2 men in suits. Not lawyers, we realized, but union representatives he'd somehow enlisted. He was building an army for his return. The district manager met them at the door, refusing entry. Greg produced documents, injunctions, and corporate policies. The argument grew heated, drawing attention from protesters and passing customers. Greg was creating a scene, knowing it would pressure corporate to resolve things quickly. Inside, the staff watched nervously. Some moved away from windows, others stood firm. Greg's wife approached the door, and for a moment, husband and wife faced each other through glass. Whatever passed between them, it ended with her turning away, and Greg's mask slipping further. The standoff continued for an hour. Greg's representatives argued procedures while the district manager held his ground. Corporate executives made frantic phone calls. The protesters grew louder. Everything Greg touched became chaos. Finally, a compromise was reached. Greg would be allowed to retrieve personal items under supervision. He entered like a returning king, his supporters flanking him, but the staff's united silence spoke louder than any protest. We watched him without fear, without deference. Greg went to the office, packing items slowly, making a show of each movement. He was stalling, hoping to find an opening, but Christopher and 2 security guards shadowed his every move. His performance had no audience willing to watch. As he prepared to leave, Greg stopped at Lucy's booth one last time. His wife had left the backpack there, perhaps intentionally. He reached for it, then pulled back as if burned. For once, he had no words, no manipulation ready. The evidence of his failure as a father was too heavy. He left without the backpack, without his usual threats or promises, but I saw him palm something from the office, a small item concealed in his hand. Security missed it, focused on the briefcase. Greg still had tricks we hadn't discovered. The rest of the day passed intense preparation. The crisis team implemented new policies while staff tried to process everything. Greg's wife returned briefly, collecting Lucy's things. She paused before leaving, addressing the staff with quiet dignity. She apologized for Greg's actions, taking no responsibility but acknowledging our pain. She revealed that Lucy was recovering but would need extended care. The medical bills would destroy them financially. Greg's pursuit of money had cost them everything. As evening approached, we learned Greg had been formally terminated, the corporate investigation finding sufficient cause. But termination was just paperwork. Greg had proven that policies couldn't contain him. We prepared for whatever retaliation he might plan. The district manager announced he'd stay overnight, sleeping in the office to prevent another break-in. Christopher volunteered to join him. Others offered to take shifts. Greg had created something he'd never intended, a unified team willing to protect each other. But unity couldn't prevent every threat. As we cleaned up for closing, Margaret discovered her car tires slashed. No cameras covered that section of the parking lot. No proof linked it to Greg. But we all knew the war was escalating. The next morning brought an eerie calm. I arrived early to find the locks already changed again. New security protocols posted on every door. The district manager sat in the office, surrounded by paperwork, his face drawn from another sleepless night. He waved me over, showing me overnight emails from corporate lawyers warning about potential litigation from Greg. Margaret arrived with a bandaged hand, having cut herself on glass shards hidden in her locker. No one could prove Greg's involvement, but the timing was too convenient. She refused to be intimidated, immediately organizing the morning shift with her usual efficiency, despite the injury. Christopher discovered more sabotage in the kitchen. Equipment had been subtly damaged, not enough to be obvious, but sufficient to cause problems during busy periods. The temporary manager documented everything while trying to maintain operations. Her frustration showed as she realized the depth of Greg's knowledge about our systems. By mid-morning, new problems emerged. Several staff members received anonymous calls threatening their employment if they continued cooperating with corporate's investigation. The voices were disguised, but the information was too specific to be anyone but Greg. He knew personal details, family situations, financial vulnerabilities. The crisis team expanded their investigation, bringing in forensic accountants to examine years of records. They discovered irregularities in inventory reports, suspicious patterns in scheduling, evidence of Greg manipulating numbers to enhance his performance metrics. His corruption ran deeper than just the recent poisoning. I helped them trace documentation showing how Greg had systematically driven away employees who questioned him, always careful to create paper trails that justified his actions. The pattern stretched back months, a careful campaign of control and intimidation hidden beneath corporate speak and policy citations. operations. The temporary manager implemented buddy systems for all staff, ensuring no one worked alone or left alone. But Greg's influence persisted through the employees he'd cultivated, those still loyal through fear or misguided gratitude. They reported our movements, creating an intelligence network within our own workplace. During lunch prep, we discovered the walk-in freezer's temperature had been tampered with overnight. Thousands of dollars in inventory had to be discarded. The new security cameras somehow missed the perpetrator. Their angles conveniently shifted. Greg's knowledge of blind spots remained his advantage. Margaret coordinated with other restaurant locations, warning them about Greg's tactics. We learned he'd already applied to several, using falsified references and omitting his termination. His network of enablers extended beyond our walls, former employees who owed him favors or feared his retribution. The district manager received a formal cease and desist letter from Greg's attorney, claiming defamation and wrongful termination. The legal maneuvering had begun in earnest. Corporate lawyers responded, but Greg had chosen his representation well, someone who specialized in exploiting procedural technicalities. Christopher noticed unusual activity in the parking lot. Former employees who'd left under suspicious circumstances during Greg's reign were photographing the building, documenting our routines. They scattered when approached but returned later, maintaining surveillance from public property where we couldn't intervene. The afternoon brought a health department inspection, triggered by an anonymous complaint about contamination. The inspector found nothing wrong, but the disruption cost us hours and created more stress. Greg's strategy was clear: death by 1,000 cuts, wearing us down through constant pressure. I discovered Greg had been spreading rumors in the community, painting himself as a whistleblower who'd been terminated for exposing corporate corruption. Some believed him, creating a counter-narrative that complicated corporate's response. His manipulation extended far beyond our walls. The crisis team brought in a security consultant who identified numerous vulnerabilities Greg could exploit: hidden keys, unchanged passwords on older systems, maintenance access codes he'd memorized. The consultant's report was sobering, revealing how thoroughly Greg had embedded himself in every aspect of operations. Margaret's documentation proved invaluable as corporate built their defense. Her recordings captured Greg's escalating behavior, his admissions of targeting homeless individuals, his complete lack of remorse even for Lucy. But legal proceedings moved slowly while Greg's harassment continued daily. The temporary manager struggled to maintain morale as staff members began calling in sick, too stressed to face another day of uncertainty. Those who remained worked under constant tension, jumping at unexpected sounds, suspicious of every customer who lingered too long or asked unusual questions. Evening shifts became particularly tense. Greg's car would appear at random times, circling the parking lot just within legal boundaries. He never approached directly but made his presence known, a constant reminder that he was watching, waiting for opportunities. Christopher organized self-defense workshops during break times, teaching basic awareness and safety techniques. The fact that we needed such measures in our workplace spoke volumes about how far the situation had deteriorated. Greg had transformed our restaurant into a fortress of fear. The district manager finally received approval to hire private security, but budget constraints limited coverage to peak hours. Greg quickly identified the gaps, his harassment adapting to our defenses. He remained several steps ahead, using his institutional knowledge against us. Margaret discovered her personal information had been posted on various websites, her address and phone number exposed. Other staff members found similar violations of privacy. Greg was escalating beyond workplace harassment into personal attacks, but always through proxies that provided plausible deniability. Corporate's investigation expanded as more evidence surfaced. They found connections between Greg and suppliers who'd overcharged for years, kickback schemes hidden in complex invoicing. His termination had disrupted a network of corruption that explained his desperate attempts to return. The temporary manager implemented a communication blackout, requiring all staff to change phone numbers and avoid social media. But Greg's reach extended through mutual acquaintances, former customers he'd cultivated, people who didn't understand they were being used as intelligence assets. I spent my breaks documenting everything, creating backup records of each incident. The police couldn't act on most complaints, citing insufficient evidence or jurisdictional limitations. Greg had studied the boundaries of legal harassment, operating just within them. Lucy's condition became our rallying point. Her innocent suffering reminded us why we couldn't give up. Margaret organized a fund to help with her medical bills, the staff contributing despite their own financial struggles. Even this act of kindness had to be done secretly, fearing Greg would somehow corrupt it. The crisis team presented their preliminary findings to corporate leadership. The scope of Greg's actions had implications beyond our location, revealing systemic failures in oversight and accountability. Major policy changes were being discussed, but those discussions didn't help our immediate situation. Christopher caught one of Greg's loyalists attempting to plant something in the employee break room. The confrontation was brief but revealing, the loyalist breaking down and admitting Greg had promised to help with immigration issues in exchange for cooperation. The web of manipulation used people's vulnerabilities against them. As weeks passed, the constant pressure took its toll. 2 experienced servers quit, unable to handle the stress. Others transferred to different locations. Greg was winning through attrition, slowly dismantling the team that had opposed him. The temporary manager was replaced by someone more experienced in crisis management. This new manager immediately implemented stricter protocols, but also brought a colder, more corporate approach that alienated staff accustomed to family-style management. Margaret remained our anchor, her determination inspiring others to persist. She coordinated with labor lawyers, exploring options for collective action. Greg had taught us the importance of unity, though not in the way he'd intended. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former employee reached out to Margaret, sharing documentation of Greg's earlier schemes at previous locations. The pattern was consistent: escalating control, financial manipulation, and eventual destruction of anyone who opposed him. Corporate's legal team used this information to build a comprehensive case. They discovered Greg had been falsifying credentials, claiming degrees and certifications he'd never earned. His entire career was built on deception, each position obtained through increasingly elaborate lies. The district manager called an all-staff meeting to share updates. Greg's legal challenges were failing, judges seeing through his procedural manipulations. Criminal charges were being considered for the poisoning incident. The tide was finally turning, but Greg wasn't finished. That night, the restaurant's main computer system was hacked, customer data compromised. The attack was sophisticated but bore hallmarks of inside knowledge. Corporate's IT security worked through the night to assess the damage. Christopher noticed Greg's car in the parking lot during the chaos, watching as emergency tech support arrived. He was documenting our response, learning our new vulnerabilities. Even facing legal consequences, he continued his campaign of disruption. The new manager implemented a complete technology overhaul, replacing systems Greg might have compromised. The cost was staggering, but corporate had finally recognized the true price of allowing someone like Greg to embed himself so deeply in operations. Margaret's persistence paid off when she connected with other victims from Greg's past. Their stories revealed a pattern spanning years, always the same escalation from charm to control to destruction. Together, they provided testimony that strengthened both civil and criminal cases. I watched Greg's final appearance at the restaurant from across the street. He came with sheriff's deputies to collect items from a storage unit he'd maintained. His confident stride had been replaced by furtive glances, his commanding presence diminished to nervous energy. The staff gathered to watch him leave, our silence more powerful than any confrontation. He tried to break us through fear and manipulation, but we'd survived through unity and determination. His reign of terror was ending not with drama, but with with quiet legal procedures. In the following days, normalcy slowly returned. Customer trust rebuilt gradually as word spread about our stand against Greg. The community that had initially condemned us began to understand we were victims too, manipulated by someone who'd weaponized corporate authority. The new manager proved more adaptable than expected, balancing corporate requirements with human understanding. She implemented support programs for staff traumatized by recent events, acknowledging the psychological toll of workplace harassment. Christopher was promoted to kitchen manager, his courage during the crisis recognized by corporate. Margaret received a commendation and bonus for her documentation efforts. The company finally acknowledged that employees who stand up against corruption deserve protection and reward. News came that Greg had accepted a plea deal to avoid trial. He'd serve minimal time but would be barred from management positions and required to pay restitution. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was accountability. His reputation in the industry was destroyed. Lucy's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The staff's fund had helped with immediate medical needs, and corporate quietly arranged additional support. She would carry scars from her father's actions, but she would heal. Her mother sent a thank you card that Margaret posted in the break room. The restaurant found its rhythm again. New staff joined, unaware of the full history, but benefiting from the stronger policies born from our struggle. We'd learned hard lessons about the danger of unchecked authority and the importance of speaking up. I continued working there for several more months, helping to rebuild what Greg had nearly destroyed. The experience had changed us all, making us more vigilant but also more united. We'd survived a tyrant and emerged stronger. Eventually, I moved on to other opportunities, but I stayed in touch with Margaret and Christopher. We'd shared something profound, a reminder that ordinary people can stand against abuse when they stand together. Greg had taught us that lesson, though not the way he'd intended. The restaurant thrives now, its success built on genuine care rather than fear. Greg's legacy isn't the destruction he caused, but the unity he inadvertently created. Sometimes the best revenge against those who would divide us is simply refusing to be divided. Looking back, I realized Greg's downfall was inevitable. His cruelty had created the very resistance that destroyed him. He'd forgotten that power based on fear is always temporary, while bonds forged in mutual support can endure anything. The last I heard, Greg was working in a warehouse. His management dreams forever ended. His wife had divorced him, taking Lucy somewhere far from his influence. He'd lost everything in pursuit of control. A cautionary tale about the cost of choosing power over humanity. Our story became a case study in corporate training programs, though sanitized and anonymized. The real lesson was simpler than any policy manual could capture. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them. And when they try to poison your workplace, literal or figurative, stand together and refuse to swallow it. I hope you have a wonderful day filled with much simpler office drama than this. I'll see you in the next one.